Okay, let's talk about Trump then briefly for a second, because he's in London at the moment now, as we're chatting right now. He's obviously divisive. I think is probably a kind word to say. From a personal perspective, I don't live in America. I don't, in the US. I don't experience any of his policies. I'm certainly not as well informed as I could be. But from the outside looking in, occasionally scanning the news, his Twitter feed, his social media. And I'm just curious to see what you think about this. The worst thing, from my point of view, that he does is make it seem okay to be a troll, and to be a troll in real life, and to use the kind of language that he uses. And
I think that might be the worst thing that he does. It's possible that that's the worst thing that he does. The Trump phenomenon probably worries me less than people think it should. But there are reasons for that. The first reason is that I don't really think that the American people are more polarized now than they were 10 years ago. And the reason I think that is because for 20 years, 50% of them have voted for Republicans, 50% of them have voted for Democrats. It hasn't moved. It's been exactly the same. Now, this time they had Clinton and Trump as candidates, and perhaps that was unfortunate. And I also don't think Trump won the election. I think Clinton lost the election. It was hers. She had it in the bag. There were a number of things she did that were really not very bright, like play identity politics, that cost her the election. I don't think that the Americans are any more polarized than they were under Nixon. And then that was pretty polarized. Like, there was violence on the campuses. There was more violence in that period of time than there is now, and more polarization. Of course, the war in Vietnam was still going on. I don't think that it's obvious that the Americans are more polarized than they were under Reagan. Maybe they are, but I don't think it's worse than under Nixon. And so they've muddled through this sort of thing before. Trump is an anomaly, in my estimation. He isn't a typical Republican. He's quite bombastic and assertive. He's not a typical conservative. In fact, he wasn't a conservative, I don't think, at all before. He's a registered Democrat, I think. Yeah, and he's got an entrepreneurial bent as well. And entrepreneurial types tend to be liberal.
Well, that's where he sold himself, I suppose, as president.
Well, he is an entrepreneur. Yeah. He's an author. He had a successful TV show. He's had his real estate dealings. And you can quibble about how successful he was at some of those things. He was certainly successful on TV. And so he's got an entrepreneurial temperament. So he's a strange person. He's an idiosyncratic person. And the one thing I would say in his favor, as far as I'm concerned so far, is that he has not embroiled the U.S. in an additional stupid war. And that's happened a lot in the last 15 years. And the fact that that hasn't happened so far, I'm quite happy about. So he's noisy. He's provocative, that's for sure. He seems impulsive, although it's hard to tell how much of that is crafted, He's definitely disagreeable, which is quite interesting, and that comes out in his Twitter behavior and so forth, and in the way that he handles his political allies, for that matter. He's certainly not currying favor, and you can make the case that he's a divisive figure, and perhaps that's the case. But
at least on a global scale. From the outside looking in. I'm not. You're traveling through America. I'm not.
America's very more upset than I've seen it. People are more upset in the United States than I've seen. Certainly, I lived there for 6 years in the 90s. People are more upset now than they were then. The tension is palpable. But I'm not convinced that reflects a genuine polarization on the part of the populace itself. There's lots of factors at play. What I'm hoping for is a return to normative incompetence among politicians. That would be really nice. Moderate left, moderate right, reasonable discussion, certain underlay of ineradicable corruption, small-scale corruption that you always see in political systems, but none of this ideological excess. That would be lovely.
Reasonable discussion, I think, is the...
Well, reasonable stupidity. You mentioned earlier, that Chris Rock's proposition that we're all fools. It's like, true enough, and that's basically what we can expect from our politicians as well, but there's a kind of normative foolishness that would be a real relief in my estimation. And so I'm hoping that's what happened in my home province, because we had a government that were nominally centrist. They were the Liberal Party, which is the centrist party in Canada, but they were really quite radical leftists. And they didn't really give a damn about the fact that the party they had taken over was traditionally Canada's centrist party. And they were pushing ideological nonsense, and they got absolutely thrashed in the last election, virtually lost official party status from a majority. And now we have a center-right premier who I'm hoping will be normally incompetent for the next 4 years. That would be just exactly what we need. So I'm not too worried about the situation in the United States. I think the Americans have been through far worse than what they're going through now. The economy's in reasonable shape, although people argue about how sustainable that is. I think what's happening in North Korea is extremely interesting. I mean, I'm not optimistic about it because anybody with any sense would never be optimistic about North Korea, but it could be worse. And I mean, how do you judge the success of an American president? Not engaging in a stupid war is a nice start.